Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the first Dumbox debate of the semester. This is our 10th. Yeah, you can clap for that. This is our 10th Dumbox debate, so we're pretty excited for it. So everybody can start to take a seat, and while everybody's still getting settled, I'm just going to briefly go over the rules of the night. You can see them in this brochure. So yeah, this is your guideline for the night. So we're going to begin with opening speeches. The four presenters who have so kindly given some of their time to give a few opening speeches for us are going to give 6-minute speeches. And after that, we're going to move on to the main open floor period of the debate, where anybody can come up, give a speech lasting 5 minutes. If you would like, you can take questions. It's highly encouraged that you take questions. You might get booed or hissed if you don't take questions, but you don't have to. So after the open floor period, we're going to move on to the lightning round period, where maybe if you're not feeling confident enough to give a full 5-minute speech. Obviously, you don't have to take up the full 5 minutes. You can give whatever length of speech you want. Or if you just want to make a couple quick points, the lightning round, anybody can give a speech lasting up to 2 minutes. You'll have no questions after this, so no need to worry about that. And after that, we'll move on to concluding speeches by again, our presenters to concluding speeches, and then we'll all vote, and we'll see who wins this debate. Now, some of the rules. I already briefly mentioned the expressions of approval. You can call out, "Hear, hear," or you can stomp your feet. Or if you're not a big feet stomper or, hear, hear, you can wave these things. I guess Clem informed me earlier that they do that in British Parliament, so apparently that's a thing. So yeah, and at the end of any given speech, you need to stand up to be recognized by the chair. So that's it's pretty self-explanatory. You'll stand up, and the chair will say, "The chair recognizes you." So then you can get up and give your speech. So yeah, and one other thing is no applause. We try to keep applause to the minimum, except at the beginning and the end of the debates. On questions, there's no follow-up questions allowed because this is a debate. It's not a seminar. We're not not that we're not after truth, but we want to win. So there's that. One big thing is the use of notes. You can't use any notes, and the debate hasn't started yet, so I can use notes. So ha ha ha. And the one other thing that you can see on this pamphlet is that you should refer to people in the third person generally. So for example, you'd call Mr. Denley over there, Mr. Chairman, because he's our chairman, instead of, Paul or whatever. And now one other thing are points of order. If for example, somebody is using notes, you can stand up and say point of order, and if you're recognized by the chair, then you can make your point of order. Say maybe you're not clear on a rule or something, or you think somebody's broken some rule. That's what points of order are for. One other thing is Gavin, the gavel, who's over there. When Gavin speaks, you listen. So there's that. And we've introduced a new thing this time, a little bell. So we'll ding that when you've got 1 minute left on your speech. That way, Gavin's wrath isn't confused with anything else. Yeah, that's about it. So I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers. So on the affirming side, we have Dr. William Newton, who is a professor of theology right here at Franciscan University, as well as Mr. Athanasius Cyrilla, who is a sophomore majoring in math and philosophy with honors. So they could please step forward and take their places. Now, on our opposing side, we have our very own Miss Carrie Pernham, who is a senior majoring in international business, as well as Mr. David Willey, a sophomore majoring in humanities and Catholic culture. So they could please step forward. The old left hand. And last but certainly not least, we have Paul Denley, Mr. Chairman.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our David's going to whine. Okay, that's good. So the motion for this evening is this House believes that the First Amendment undermines the Catholic view of church and state. I'm going to sit down and hand over the floor to Dr. Newman for the opening speech and the affirming side.
Is that on? Oh yeah, that's on. Okay, I think the argument's fairly straightforward. It goes like this, very, very simple. The church definitively teaches that the state ought to recognize her and recognize her unique mission to save mankind, given to us by our Lord Jesus Christ. And this is consistently and definitively taught in multiple documents of the church, particularly from the period of Pius IX through to Leo XIII. It's definitive, irreformable teaching of the highest level. Church teaches that because the state has the duty to its citizens to do what is best for those citizens, and what is best for those citizens is they get to heaven. And only the Catholic Church has the tools and means to get them there, and therefore the state must recognize the unique position of the Catholic Church. In comparison, we have the First Amendment to the US Constitution, which says completely the opposite, that the state ought not to do that which it ought to do. I'll just let that rest on you for a moment. Now, one can, I think, easily see then that the two are opposed to each other. The next question becomes whether this opposition leads to an undermining of the teaching. And I think it undermines the teaching in two ways. One is, it makes it nearly impossible for the state to do what the state ought to do. That definitely undermines the teaching of the church, of the duty of the state towards the Catholic Church. It also teaches everybody who's listening to the US Constitution, particularly American citizens, including Catholic American citizens, that somehow the church and state ought to be separated, that the ideal is a separation, because in constitutional law, you frame law that is ideal, and so it has a pedagogical value. So it clearly teaches something which is opposed to what the Catholic Church teaches. Therefore, it must be an undermining type of teaching. Briefly, I'll touch upon just three possible objections. One objection is that the Constitution never says, or by the word established means the state has no right to set up its own church. But this is clearly not the case, because the First Amendment of the American Constitution flows from a law in Virginia which de-established the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. So it's clear here that establishment means not only that the state may not set up a church, but the state may not recognize any other church with the kind of privileges which the Catholic Church teaches ought to be given to the Catholic Church. Secondly, one might say as an objection, no, it's just a practical arrangement. All the American Constitution's First Amendment says that as it stands at the moment of the founding of America, we ought not to establish a church. Well, if that's the case, then they should simply have said nothing and not established a church. But they have put an amendment in the Constitution which makes it nearly impossible for the state ever to do what the state ought to do. They are saying, therefore, it is never expedient to recognize the Catholic Church. Therefore, it's teaching something radically undermining of the Catholic position. Finally, I've not touched upon at all the question of liberty. I've only touched upon the idea of establishment, but I only need to show that it's defective in one place and undermining in one place to convince you that you should support this motion. The truth is also, actually, that the Catholic Church teaches that the kind of liberty suggested by the American Constitution is not the kind of liberty understood by the Catholic Church. A privileging the Catholic Church would lead to some relative underprivileging of other faiths, and that is good and proper. So even in the clause about liberty, there is an undermining of the Catholic position. But as I said, I only focus on the Establishment Clause, or mainly focus on that. The church is clearly taught something which is completely opposed to the position laid out in the American Constitution. And the American Constitution has a pedagogical value, and therefore it undermines the Catholic teaching on the proper relationship between church and state. I urge you to support the motion.
So for the opposing side, the first speaker will be Ms. Burham. Called up.
All right, thank you, Mr. Newton, for that wonderful speech, and it is wonderful to see everyone here tonight. Mr. Chairman, I ask you to please reread the First Amendment for the audience.
Okay, the First Amendment, or at least the section in question, reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Okay, thank you. So there are three words I want everyone to focus on here, and that is establishment, Congress, and respecting. Okay, so Mr. Willie and I would first like to argue overall that the First Amendment allows for state religion, not federal religion. Okay, and so for the other side to win, they must prove that the First Amendment states that, or no, they must prove that the Catholic Church point of view says that religion must be established at the federal level, but it doesn't. So we argue that the First Amendment is actually in line with the Catholic view, and that it also provides an ecosystem within which it can thrive. Okay, so there are three aspects which I want to focus on, and so that they are political, historical, and theological. Now, regarding the political, so America was founded on, after the Revolutionary War, it was founded on an overarching Congress, but with state autonomy and authority. Okay, and so the Bill of Rights, when it was ratified in 1791, was ratified, it basically, all of it was not to give the Congress, so much authority, because that's more, English, or that kind of government was English, and that's what they were kind of running away from. Sure. And so they wanted state authority, they wanted state autonomy. Okay, and so the First Amendment is in line with that Catholic view. And this leads me into my second point, which is historical, and that is that so the First Amendment was established in 1791, and well into the 1800s. 8 of the 13 colonies actually had established religions. So if it actually prevented states to have established religions, then it would have that would have took place then and there. But they just the disestablishment of religions occurred for many different reasons, but now because of the First Amendment. So yes. Okay, and then the third most important historical argument that I'm going to make is that the origin of the phrase separation of church and state actually was written by Thomas Jefferson in an article to Danbury Baptist, very famous article because it's Jefferson, of course, and he came up with the phrase separation of church and state. And so this phrase, he derived it from the first half of the First Amendment, which is the Establishment Clause, which you guys talked a lot about, but that's not even the entire amendment. And so he only derived it from that first half of the First Amendment, and that's where the origin of that whole phrase came from. And so basically, this entire debate is based on a false interpretation of the First Amendment. And finally, I want to talk about the theological arguments. First and foremost, the First Amendment is an example of subsidiarity, because subsidiarity is a Catholic social teaching that says that all matters should be handled at the most local level, because that really does provide for true conversion to occur, and that is so. The First Amendment allows for the states to decide, so it's an example of subsidiarity. Second, Thomas Jefferson in his Summa Articles said that a government already in existence basically shouldn't be forced to operate under Catholicism because in order to avoid scandal. And so it's also in line with that kind of Catholic social teaching that you should never force an already established government to operate under Catholicism, and that that should lie within the states and the people to do that sort of thing. And then finally, there are several occasions in the Catholicism where it states that civil authority should not force beliefs and should not force anyone into the sacraments, and that for a sacrament to actually be valid, it has to be voluntary. And so if the government were to force that, then it would make it completely immoral. And so in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, the entire debate is kind of based on false misinterpretation, which originated with Jefferson, immorality. And so we stand true to the fact that the First Amendment really does allow for Catholicism to flourish in America. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now I'd like to invite the second speaker from the affirming side, Mr. Cirilla, to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So last semester, I was having a conversation with my friend, Kater, which, by the way, Kater, if you're watching this, I miss you. Have fun in Austria. But anyway, so last semester, I was having a conversation with my friend, and naturally, the conversation took a turn to what the ideal state would look like. And so Kater said, Athanasius, what do you think the ideal state would look like? And I said, well, first of all, let's get this out of the way. I believe that, the state would recognize Catholicism as the true religion. And Kater was like, whoa, no, Nash, I mean, that's not true, that all religions should be treated as equal. And I was confused about that. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight in this speech, I would like to primarily talk about how the United States of America, in their First Amendment, and how it's been introduced by the Founding Fathers, how it's been interpreted through the Supreme Court, and how people view it today, undermines the teaching of the Catholic Church by leading American Catholics today, even those of Franciscan, to have a misunderstanding of what the Church teaches on this subject. First of all, I'd like to talk about the Founding Fathers and the Supreme Court, which I think are two very crucial aspects in this debate. And I think we have to keep going back to this throughout the night, because this is going to really unlock what the First Amendment means. So I'd like to thank Ms. Perm for her last speech, and she gave a very, I think, logical interpretation of the First Amendment. But one thing that she failed to do is really go into detail about the two sort of establishing bodies that are set up to tell us what the First Amendment means. I meant to say the one establishing body, which is the Supreme Court, and also the Founding Fathers who wrote them. So let's look at the Founding Fathers first. So Ms. Perham brought up the example of Thomas Jefferson, but I'd also like to bring up the example of James Madison, who, along with Jefferson, helped draft the Virginia, Dr. Newton brought it up in his last speech, but it was the Virginia Freedom of Religion Bill, or something like that. And something along those lines. But what Madison said in his defense of this bill, which, by the way, is kind of generally accepted as the precursor to the First Amendment, what he said was that the state should not have the power to establish Christianity as the primary religion, because if it did that, then it would lead to the unfortunate result of having one sect be elevated above another. But as Dr. Newton said in his last speech, that's exactly what the church says we ought to do. The church has taught throughout its history that we must establish that and elevate Catholicism above all other religions. So Madison, in drafting that bill, basically said that's exactly what we don't want. That's looking at it from the Founding Fathers' perspective. But basically, the most important body we have to help us interpret what the Constitution is saying is the Supreme Court. And ladies and gentlemen, if you look at what the Supreme Court has said over the 250-so-year history of the United States of America, it has not only not aided the church's teaching on this subject, but it has directly contradicted and undermined what the church has said. Now, there are at least 15 or so Supreme Court cases that deal with church and state, but I'd like to look at two in particular. So first, let's look at Emerson versus Board of Education in 1947. Now, what this Supreme Court was ruling about, the case was about whether or not Catholic parents could be reimbursed for bus fares for sending their kids to Catholic schools. And in the majority opinion, what Chief Justice Hugo Black said is that the only reason why this law is constitutional is because it does not elevate Catholicism over any other religion. That's what he said in his majority opinion. So right there, that completely contradicts the church's teaching, and that's the Supreme Court. But then there's another very important Supreme Court case, which is in 1971. It was, I think, Lemon versus Kurtzman. I think lemon the person, not the fruit. And it was, it basically said there are 3 criteria that a law must have to be constitutional. The first criteria is that it must have a secular purpose. Second of all, the law must in no way advance or inhibit any religion. And the third one was that it cannot in any way show a connection between church and state. And these 3 pillars of what makes a law constitutional directly undermines the church's teaching because it refuses to allow legislators to enact laws that promote Catholicism, which, as Dr. Newton said, is what the church aims to do and what the church has taught the state must do. And finally, how Catholics view today. So I challenge any of you to go outside and poll the 15 or so non-theocats out there and ask them what they think the church teaches on the matter of the separation of church and state. And I guarantee that none of them, very few of them would be able to outline what Dr. Newton said in his last speech, which is essentially that the church has the obligation to, through its laws, bring its citizens to virtue and morality, and this can only be done by recognizing Catholicism as greater than all other religions. Now, I'd like to address a couple of points brought up by Ms. Perham. Specifically, I'd like to address the point, a couple of them, but first of all, the one about federal versus state religion, which they didn't really do a very good job of explaining what they meant by that. I think in this debate, we can safely assume that federal religion and state religion are the same thing, and there's not a big contradiction, and they would have to be the ones to prove that. But second of all, I'd like to challenge her point that the laws in America allow Catholicism to thrive. So I'd like to have you all think about that for 1 second. The laws of America allow Catholicism to thrive. This is completely in direct contradiction with everything we stand for, whether it be the pro-life movement, whether it be the pro-family movement. Essentially, the laws and the structure of America filtered really through the idea that religion and the state have nothing in common and shouldn't be intermixed at all. This has directly led to most of the problems that we see today because we refuse to allow Catholics to bring their religion into their decisions in making laws. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cirilla. Now we're going to move to the last opening speech, and then we're going to go to the open floor section where anyone can stand up and give a speech about the same length as the opener. So you can go ahead and start thinking about your ideas. You can just indicate that you want to speak by either standing up or raising your hand, then I'll recognize you. So, Mr. Willie, you're welcome to speak now.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's very nice to be here. I actually almost wasn't able to debate tonight because I was at the first Franciscan volleyball game last night, and I got very carried away and was screaming incredibly loudly for our team, which played really well. And then I began losing my voice. So I was like, I didn't trust myself. Anyway, so it's wonderful to see everyone here tonight. And I would like to frame what we are trying to prove, myself, Ms. Perham, as imagine the mythological story of Odysseus, and everyone here, I'm sure, being good students, being active for the person, you know the story of Odysseus, and as he's sailing home, he has to pass through the twin dangers of Scylla and Charybdis, the many-headed monster, and the great whirlpool. Okay? And think of those as the two horns of the problem. On one side, disestablishment of the church, and on the other, forced Catholicism. The First Amendment passes through both of those problems. Yeah. And can I just say, right off the bat, we've given a clearer idea of what we mean by church and state than the opposition has, and so they've never even touched on what that even should look like. But what we're clarifying is it supports the Catholic position of church and state because it doesn't support disestablishment, the First Amendment doesn't, but it also makes sure there's not going to be any forced Catholicism, because we saw a lot of wars of religion in Europe. With that in mind, let's move into the three historical and theological points. Under the political point, how do we interpret the First Amendment? Mr. Sruller and Dr. Newton gave interesting interpretations of the First Amendment. Why do we look to people like the people who wrote the Heritage Guide to the Constitution, who said the word respecting was intentionally inserted for two reasons into the First Amendment. One, so it was clear that there could never be a congressional established religion. Two, so that Congress had no authority to disestablish state religions. Any interpretation from the First Amendment that came later from Supreme Courts was a corruption of the First Amendment, and we are not required to defend anything except the words of the First Amendment. Secondly, if you look to Mark Hall, who worked for the Heritage Foundation, he's a Hoover scholar, and he wrote a great article on this, and he clarifies that while there was isolated people like Jefferson and Madison, and we knew you were going to bring up Madison, because those are the only two people you can bring up. He says that if you look broadly across the founding fathers, there was support for three broad points of consensus. The third one doesn't really matter, but the first one was that there should be religious liberty for all, which is a key tenet of Catholic teaching. Secondly, that any state establishment churches should give preferential treatment to Christianity. This is a broad point of consensus across the founding fathers, according to Mark Hall. Now, let's look at the historical point. Into the 1800s, really this changed with the Civil War when Congress began assuming more authority to itself. But well into the 1800s, 8 of the 13 colonies gave preferential treatment to various Christian denominations. So, the idea that the First Amendment doesn't allow preferential treatment for Christianity is false. Of course, maybe you're thinking to yourself, we need preferential treatment for Catholicism, not just for Christianity. And we agree, the opposing side agrees, that that is what should be aimed for. But this brings us to the point which Ms. Perham brought up, that Thomas Aquinas really makes this point very well in Summa, Section 2, Part 2, Article 10, where he says, when he's talking about should unbelievers have dominion over believers, and he says, of course, it's ideal that they shouldn't. But in a situation where a government and a country is already established, as America had been for 150 years, you shouldn't, the church, though it has the authority to require the country to become Catholic, should not do so in order to avoid scandal. This is really important. When America ratified the Bill of Rights, 98% of the population was Protestant, 1.9% was Catholic. It would have been a huge cause of scandal to require the church to issue a declaration saying, you must be a Catholic country. However, remember, the word says undermines. The First Amendment undermines. To undermine means to erode, to lead away from. But the First Amendment allows for a shift towards Catholicism. It leads the church to organize evangelizing. If we can evangelize in states, then that means, if we can evangelize in the states, that means that states can then choose to move towards Catholicism. They can establish preferential treatment for the church at the state level. So really, the fact that this hasn't happened is partly due to people like Justice Black in the 1950s misinterpreting the First Amendment, and partly due to the fact that American Catholics haven't done a good enough job evangelizing the culture. So, as we move throughout the rest of the debate, remember the purpose of the Bill of Rights. It's to preserve and promote state autonomy. It's to spell out exactly what must be allowed, what Congress cannot touch, basically. And Congress cannot establish a religion. And Congress cannot disestablish state religions. But this is, I think with all of these debates are so practical, I really want everyone to leave this debate thinking that it's our responsibility as Catholics to evangelize the culture and then to see the fruits of that in preferential treatment of the church. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Willie, and thank you to all the speakers this evening. And now I'm going to open up the floor. Anyone can speak. Just stand up and raise your hand. Chair recognizes Dr. Cirillo.
Thank you all. I appreciate this. So I've been told by one of the debate participants, Mr. Williams. I think there may be 90% agreement in the sense that, pragmatically speaking, right now, it's not a real possibility to institute a Catholic state in this country. So that's where the wisdom of the church and new evangelization comes in. So that's the first thing. But on the level of ideas, which are very significant, still very practical, the issue remains whether the First Amendment undermines the Catholic view of church and state. So from what you told me, I hope you don't mind me sharing it, the committee tried to get a number of folks in our department of theology to debate on your side of the aisle, and you couldn't. I'll tell you why. We've all taken an oath, and even though I understand you don't have to hold the view that you're debating for, because we've taken an oath to avoid scandal, I'm telling you, the people who refuse do it because we know what Dr. Newton said, which is the teaching of the church is definitive, not on religious liberty. That's non-definitive magisterial teaching of Vatican II. The teaching of the church is definitive. The teaching of Leo XIII in Immortale Dei and in Libertas, two encyclicals from the late 19th century. And also Pius XI reaffirms this in his encyclical Quas Primas, in which he establishes the feast of Christ the King. And here's the teaching. Every state, on all levels, not just a local federation of states, but on a federal level, and in any form of government, has the duty, objectively, to honor God by recognizing Him, Jesus Christ, and the church that Christ established as the only true religion. There's truth in other religions, absolutely, mixed with falsehood. But the Catholic Church is the one established by God through His Son, Christ. Now, I think there's been a bit of a binary falsehood here that, like, if you establish it, then you're coercing and forcing people. Not necessarily, okay? If a state, there's many ways states historically can and have recognized Catholicism, Jesus Christ, and the true faith. It could be in a constitutional document like in Ireland, or at least used to be in Ireland's document. Or it could just be through a majority of the people being Catholic and having holidays, like we are a Christian nation, Christmas, Easter, etc. Okay, there's a lot of ways to do without being coercive. Leo XIII in the document, Libertas, says exactly what you said, quoting Aquinas, that in order to avoid scandal, you may want to tolerate false religion, tolerate them, lest a greater evil come about. So the definitive teaching is that the state has a duty, and this is why, theologically, the state has a duty, and this is in these documents. And I want to mention, I think it's unfair that you all can ask for quotes from the Constitution, but not from the church documents. But there are so many that I understand. So here's the thing. The argument is this. Christ paid the price of the cross and His blood, not only to redeem every individual human, but the entire universal community of humans in all of its strata. Individuals, families, clans, tribes, states, nations. And because He paid that price, He has an ownership claim over us. And we have a corresponding duty to recognize Him as Lord and to honor Him not just privately, but publicly. The state has that duty. And with this Vatican II, Dignitatis Humanae reaffirms this unequivocally in the first article, second article of Dignitatis Humanae, Vatican II on religious liberty. It says, this subsequent teaching in the article in the document on religious liberty leaves intact the traditional teaching of the Church on the duties of individuals and societies towards God and the one true Church that He established. So I think the issue is that I think you guys are onto something, that the First Amendment is kind of vague enough that it can survive a great, and maybe not impede, a great Catholic re-evangelization in this country, which has to happen first. You don't change the Constitution and then all of a sudden Catholic. That's absolutely right. it may not impede that. So, so that's good. But at some point, if we do re-evangelize this country or evangelize it because Catholic, I think the First Amendment has to go because taking Catholic teaching seriously, this state, even on a federal level, has a duty to honor God. Here, here, and here.
Is the Honorable Doctor open to questioning?
I am. Do you need me to stay here?
Any questions? Mr. Willie?
So, where do you get the impression that the First Amendment actually contradicts, because the notion of union of church and state hasn't been spelled out, where do you get the impression that it undermines the Catholic teaching of First Amendment?
The way that the First Amendment has been used, I mean, well, let me respond to the question. After the Constitutional Congress, 1780, what state has, do you know of any states who tried to establish a religion? I don't.
You can respond.
Yeah, well, so as we said in our speech, 8 of the 13 colonies...
So this is prior. I'm saying after the Constitutional...
No, yeah, so after,
Yeah.
into the 1880s, well, until about 1880.
Maryland, my home state, had a bunch
So
of
they
states.
showed preferential treatment to...
Preferential, but after the...
But that doesn't actually, does that undermine the Catholic view of church and state, which you said could be simply at the federal level recognizing Christian holidays and recognizing the Christianity of the nation, which was evidently happening.
No, not Christianity, Catholicism.
Sure.
Okay, David, no more dialogue.
It wouldn't just be Christmas and Easter, it would be December 8th, September 8th, etc. And false, oh, here's the other thing, the free exercise thing, there are religions that cause harm to the public good, and Vatican II says if that's happening, you can prohibit the exercise of that. Dignitatis Humani says that. The U.S. Constitution does not. That's why Satanists are able to perform their horrible things, and at least they appeal to it, and they successfully appeal to it in was it St. Louis or in Boston, where they try to get hold of Eucharist for Black Mass. Yeah. We have a student, an MA student from Harvard here, and he was there when they had tried to have the Black Mass. They're appealing to the First Amendment.
So normally we don't allow dialogue. There can be any more questions.
Oh, sorry.
I'll take, if you want to take a couple more questions.
Okay.
Normally we don't allow dialogue, but being a doctor has its privileges.
I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
Dr. Claiborne?
Thank you, Dr. Cirillo. I appreciate that speech a lot, and I missed Dr. So I'm sure it was good. Oh. Hi, I guess I should come out here. Then we can go at it. Get your dukes up.
We agree.
No, yeah. I know. I was just, what I wanted to ask you was, indeed I have. However, being a philosopher, I'm much more imaginative. So I can imagine what a very sophisticated opponent might say. So what I wanted to know is, since you, Dr. Newton, and maybe some other people in here are far more informed than I am about the doctrinal history and all, if you could just give the people in the house here who might be wondering, what would a sophisticated opponent have to say, such as the same level of sophistication you, if they were to be on the other side there, and to say, okay, granted there's this duty and there's all this stuff you say about Christ the King that makes sense, right? But people might be thinking off the top of their head, well, why is it that there's so many Catholics that are up in arms and irate and irritated about this constantly, all the time, right? Why not think, well, that's kind of a fringy interpretation and think that that stuff implies that. You see what I'm saying? The stuff about Christ the King and the duty to acknowledge the church and all that implies undermining, right? So that's my question, I guess. I'm not taking a position.
So what would
on the
someone
floor
say
here.
in objection to what?
They would, a sophisticated objector would say the word declaramus is what they would say. They would say Vatican II, Dignitatis Humani, uses the word declaramus when they declare a right to religious liberty in ways that are problematic, in my opinion, and in tension with prior church teaching, despite the opening few paragraphs of Dignitatis Humani. All right, so one of my colleagues has said, you know, it seems definitive, if not, it's not a solemn definition, but Vatican II seems definitive because it uses the word declaramus, we declare, right? But it doesn't, I would say, look, it doesn't say definimus, it doesn't say we define. And that's definitive. And the issue is that and here's where the problem is, like kind of, over you, is that Vatican II is alleging a natural right, not just a civil right, I think, of humans to worship even in false religions and to proselytize publicly. Okay, whereas prior to that, the church said, you really shouldn't do that, but the state can tolerate it, but it's not a good thing. Vatican II seems to be saying it's a good thing, right? So that's it, right?
So just to clarify.
How does it fit to the
I
first
didn't
one?
quite follow the first one about the Latin word.
Yeah, declaramus, we declare it.
Okay, so what you're saying is.
I'm saying it's still
the best
non-definitive.
argument on the opponent's side would be taking documents from Vatican II and saying those, right, make room for what the First
Amendment does.
That's-
Which First Amendment does seem to exclude, on the federal level, a federal recognition of God and the Catholic Church established by Christ as the one true church. Okay? Yeah. But then they have the problem of, okay, fine, you want to say Vatican II requirements is definitive, but then what if it contradicts the earlier stuff? What do you do?
The Honorable Doctor is thanked. Now I will open up the floor to another speech. The chair will recognize this gentleman here, whose name he does not know.
Zachary Mercugliano. Like Mr. Willie, my voice went through a bit of a ringer yesterday. Unlike him, I actually lost it. So if you'll bear with me. President Lincoln said that this country, America, is run of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, that's not just mere semantics. That is rooted in the words of St. Robert Bellarmine, who is a doctor of the church. He said that government had the responsibility to represent its citizens. Now, the citizens of the United States are not all Catholic. One can think to the state of Utah, which for a long time was a majority Mormon. And the representatives of that state were, for about 90 years, entirely Mormon. Now, if the state of Utah were to, in some way, bypass the First Amendment, there could theoretically be a law that would establish Mormonism as a state religion and require taxes or tithe, similar to the way that in Massachusetts, for a long time, you had your state tax and you had your church tax to whatever state religion there was before it was a state anyway. In the United States, then, there is a need for us to be able to express our religion individually. Because as individuals, we are members of the society. We may speak in the government and be in the government, while the government itself does not establish a religion of its own. And so, if the First Amendment, which, if I can ask you to reread it.
I'm only going to do this because it's in the brochure. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Well, no law promoting the establishment of a religion. If there was to be a law established promoting religion, a specific religion, then, as I said, with Mormonism, you could have a situation in which there might be the desire for a moral pressure to join this particular religion. And it's been shown in various confessional states or theocracies that in some way can corrupt that church, politicizing it, so to speak. And so having a First Amendment like this actually supports the church's teaching in that it allows us to express our religion as individuals, even in government, without the government needing to do that. Because, again, as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as the people, we may express religion ourselves.
We'll field 2 questions for the gentleman. Let me speak.
No, I'm not as well-versed in church documents as Dr. Cirillo or American history as much as Mr. Willie, but I did have a question. It did seem to me that your speech didn't, it seemed to address more of a pragmatic standpoint of how this First Amendment is going to be lived out personally, how this affects the state on sort of an interpersonal level or individual level. But what we're talking about is, as Dr. Cirilla, I think, would agree with, is we're actually talking about the different strata of society itself. So the state as a whole, and the family as a whole, and different organizations as a whole, respecting Christ as king of the universe and as king of the whole world itself, right? So my real question is, I understand you're coming at it from a pragmatic standpoint. People can do this sort of thing, and that can affect the state, but the state itself is, as the First Amendment says, cannot actually make laws or other statutes to establish Catholicism as its main religion, which seems to be the church's stance that it should. So my real question to you is, how did you address Dr. Cirilla's point?
I wasn't as much responding to Dr. Cirilla as I was to the concept at large.
Okay, right.
But in regards to what I believe you're trying to say, again, this society, any society, as you said, built on different strata, each one made up of people. The family, made up of 5 to 10 individuals. The town council, made up of 10 to 20. The governing body of a state, maybe 50. Each of these people, all free to express religion as they see fit. Allowing for a religion then to spread and propagate, just as the Catholic Church has through the ages, through individuals, rather than a state, a body that is formless, made up of ideas, doing that for you. The people themselves are allowed to have this free discourse and actually engage in the propagation of religion, living out evangelization as it's always been lived out.
Good.
One more question for the gentleman. Mr. Cirilla, you can speak.
So how would you argue that the First Amendment saying that everybody can practice all religions equally doesn't undermine the church's teaching that Catholicism has to be the promoted above other religions?
Well, I don't see it as undermining it, specifically because, well, it gives the Catholics just as much right to prove the truth through their own lives. They'll know that we're Christians. They'll know the way we live. They'll know what we believe by the way we live. And so the Catholic Church is given a better chance of demonstrating that it is the true religion by allowing individuals to prove their faith than by some body of governance telling it to be so. Let us show that through the way we live, in contrast to every other group. And let that be the guiding force. Because if the truth is the truth, then it will stand out. And so if there's a free body, if we have a free market of religion, so to speak, then the true religion will come out on top, as it always has, and as it always will.
All right, thank you for speaking. Also, thank you, Mr. Cirilla, for giving a proper example of questioning. Keeping a brief question and then sitting down. That's the way we want to do it. And the reason for that is because we want to have a mind shift of we're members of the House. I'm not, but you guys are members of the House. And you can raise a question, just a brief question, and then the speaker who's in the hot seat gets to address the House as a whole and not the specific person. If you want dialogue, you can stay around and have a soda and then speak to that person one-on-one later. So I'm going to open up the floor to more speeches. Chair recognizes Mr. Dinley.
Thank you, Mr.
His elder counterpart.
Thank you very much. So I'm glad to express my patriotic duties here as a fellow American. Glad to have representatives of Her Majesty the Queen with us today on both sides. It is wonderful to have those representatives. I think with the debate tonight, To Dr. Cirilla's point on that the theology department couldn't find a way to argue for the First Amendment in this regard, I wasn't terribly shocked by that. But for the one reason that I believe they're confusing the ends and the means to that end. And what I mean by that is the bringing of the kingdom of heaven to earth, that is the proper message of the gospel. The instantiation of all that is divine and all that is human. And that doesn't just mean in the spiritual or religious aspect. It also means in the social and political. And so this is the end which the church is aiming towards. And as the magisterial documents and as the church has declared throughout her existence, this is the end to which we're trying to attain. And as Christ himself says with the parable of the mustard seed, this church doesn't become the full tree instantly. And so we as a church must bring about this end. So then it's to be asked, how are we to realize the full kingdom of heaven on earth? So the First Amendment comes from a Protestant ethic, a Protestant way of viewing it, which values individual freedom above the kind of social or political imposition. So this did not come out of a Catholic, you could say, imposition. However, I will argue that the church herself, while proclaiming this end of theocracy, has undermined her own view of church and state throughout her long history. So what the church does have, and I affirm with our opponents, I affirm that the end is the kingdom of heaven, the establishment of the church in all nations. However, what the church has done in her history is claimed its spiritual authority and claimed its authority over all aspects of human life, and has tried to, while having the good motive of universal truth, has imposed on the human will and the human intellect to a point to where it revolted. And this is where the Protestant Reformation comes. It was a revolt against the individual conscience and personal free will of man against an externally imposed authority. So regardless of, I know, I'm not a Protestant fan here, by the way. I'm not arguing for the Reformation, but if you're going to admit that heresy does not arise out of nothing. And in fact, more than not, nearly all the heresies arise from a defect within the church herself. Not in her foundations, but in her members who go against what her foundations are. So the popes, in trying to claim their temporal authority and their spiritual authority, they try to impose this from the outside, the idea of theocracy, the unification of God and man in the human activity. However, the unification cannot come externally. Man himself must want the kingdom of heaven to come about at the individual level. Each person must determine for him and herself that they would wish to more fully imitate Christ in all matters. What the church did, instead of having kings and nations rise to the level of high priest and to give the good gifts of the earth to their fellow churchmen, what it did is it lowered the high priest of the church to become kings. And in doing so, it brought the moral character of the church to nothing, to where today everyone sees the church merely as a political institution. And many have argued that the church is just another instantiation of the state. So now that we find ourselves in this position where the church has lost its moral credibility, many see it as just another political organization rather than a spiritual authority. The First Amendment is the best and fertile soil from which a new understanding of theocracy and of man coming to the church is the best soil for that to spring about.
Yeah.
Man cannot have it externally imposed upon him. He must choose to make all of his life into the kingdom of heaven, in line with the church, but it must come from man to the church. The First Amendment doesn't undermine this. It's not the ideal, and this is where I agree with our opponents. The First Amendment is not the ideal, the separation, but rather it's the means by which we can attain that end. Man has to be free to choose. He has to be free to make the church, make his society like the church. The church can't make society like the church without the people's agreement, without the people's cooperation. And you can see this if you take theology, that the divine never imposes on the human will. It always wants the free cooperation. The church is no different. We need the free cooperation of every member within the church and within the state to conform themselves to the church, but it can't be externally imposed. And so we should support the First Amendment and its freedom of religion. We should work, like Mr. Willie has said, to bring about this new evangelization that people return to the church. We shouldn't be trying to externally impose what we don't have already, which is an external type of authority, and try and bring people to make the state more like the church, rather than reducing the church to another state. Thank you.
You open to questions?
I am open to questions.
Okay, the chair will now recognize questions from the House. The chair recognizes Dr. Newt.
Did I just hear you say that the best way to make something happen is to make it impossible to happen?
What are you referring to here?
Well, I'm referring to your argument, which seems to say the best way of making ultimately the situation we want to get to, where the Catholic Church is recognized, is to actually make it impossible for that to happen, which is what the First Amendment does. That's what you just argued.
So,
the best way to make anything happen is to make it impossible to happen.
so yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think what it gets to is with regards to what is the ideal, and this is where we both agree on that, is that when we put this kind of separation of church and state regard, you said we implicitly make it an ideal. And I agree with you. That's something that a lot of Americans take, that separation of church and state. We should try and make that happen for the whole world. Right? We should go into countries and say, Islamic countries, you're doing it all wrong. Get your Islam out of there. Just have the state. And I agree with you on the ideal. Okay.
So make it impossible to happen, and it's more likely to happen.
No, if you okay, well, let's provide the alternative. Let's say somehow Catholics got in the government and then said, okay, we're going to officially start recognizing Catholicism. It would be insane, it would be complete anarchy. And so the alternative to freedom of religion in the modern age is an externally imposed one. In the West, it's utterly impossible to use your language.
But if 100% of Catholics want it,
Thank you for the question.
Are there any more questions for the speaker? The chair will now recognize Mr. Tischart.
Shearhart.
Shearhart.
But close, guys.
I've only seen it spelled incorrectly in our publication.
So my question was, since it seemed to me that you were more concerned on the end and bringing about the kingdom of heaven through the people willing it, but I was wondering if having Catholic definitions on what it means to be human or what a marriage is would kind of expedite that or make it more simple rather than leave a lot of these truths to be questioned by scientism or views that differ over time.
Right, so I believe you're saying a more clear definition of what the ideals actually are.
In accordance to what we...
Right, and I think that's a fundamental part of bringing this about is a more clear understanding of these things and trying to get people to assent. And I think that goes exactly aligned with the First Amendment, which is we allow you to have this dialogue and this understanding so you can conform your will to the divine. But you can't use these definitions as a kind of club to whack the head of people and say, this is the ideal, because all they're going to do is just hit you with another club, whether it's separation of church and state or something else. And then you're left with, you're left with prehistoric club fighting. So, thank you.
Any more questions for the speaker? We'll take one more question. Chair recognizes Dr. Plato, who's been waiting patiently in the back.
So just a quick question. So suppose everybody was to become Catholic freely in this whole country, just miraculously tomorrow.
Amen. Let's do it.
The kingdom of God would be reigning in everybody's heart. Everybody would be voting in certain ways. I mean, would we have to vote away the First Amendment somehow? Or what? And if we did, maybe that and other amendments, would we even still be America in the legal sense? Would we be a new legal entity? So that's part of the impossibility question, I think, that Dr. Newton's getting at. I mean, if that was miraculously to happen. So the question really isn't, right, how do we get to that point? But the question is legally, right, what does this amendment do legally with respect to the religion, not individual people getting there or anything like that?
Right, to the legality. And that's a wonderful question. Yeah, and how do we, let's make it happen, by the way. Let's get everyone in America to be Catholic. I'm all for that. But yeah, it's a great point. Okay, well, what do we do with the First Amendment? Okay, if you hold the First Amendment as your ideal, which I do not, then you keep it. But if everyone's Catholic, if they agree on the ideal, right? What's the ideal? Making the people into more of the church and submitting to the church and giving their whole lives to becoming Christ to each other, becoming brothers and sisters. Okay, then the First Amendment, you don't need it in that sense anymore. The freedom of religion, the ideal has been realized, right? And so the kingdom of Christ is becoming on earth. And then you have to legislate appropriately. However, in our modern age where we are now, we have to wait until that point when it's actually idealized. We can't try and impose it from the outside. We're just going to have the world kick back at us. And this is the big point, we're going to lose our moral credibility when we do. Because if we try and the more we try to externally impose, the more the world is saying, you're immoral, you have no spiritual authority, who are you, this whole type of thing. It has to come from man. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Big Brother, for speaking. Yeah, I'm going to open up the floor for the next speech. The chair recognizes Mr. Fabelman.
I like to talk loud. All right. So I was talking this morning with Clem Harold, and he told me something that was quite an interesting thought. And it kind of stems actually what Mr. Denley said a moment ago. And it was that if we had a nation or a country or whatever sort of state plan you want to call it, that was whole Catholic, right? Wouldn't you want there to be a Catholic legal entity, to govern that state, right? I mean, there's no reason why you wouldn't, if everyone in the state is freely choosing to be Catholic. Now, in our debate tonight, of course, we're debating the United States of America, and this country has freedom of religion, right? And this freedom then allows for all kinds of religion. And so in terms of the ideal, you really can't, you really couldn't necessarily, impose, just like you're saying, right? It would lead to anarchy, it would lead to all sorts of chaos, hypothetically speaking. But in terms of the argument that we're dealing with tonight, which, as the motion says, this House believes that the First Amendment undermines the Catholic Church and state, I would have to agree with the affirming side in that from the Catholic Church's position as the truth and believing internally that we hold to the truth, period, then, this, I would say, does undermine, this First Amendment. And I guess I like to look at history, and see what history has, to tell us about this. And I guess I just want to kind of go through something that might be a little bit removed, but not really, in terms of what happens when the Catholic Church is not in control, or so to speak, not the authority, let's say, over the state. Because if you look, in, for example, let's go with Constantine, right? With the Edict of Milan, he declared, Christianity, Catholicism to be the religion, of the Roman Empire. And while there is the dichotomy between laws and the culture, the people like you and I, who just go about doing what we do every day, that doesn't mean that law was immediately effective. But it's a huge moment in history, and it really did shape, much of the West going forward. And then, as you get to the Middle Ages, you can, I'm taking a class right now with Dr. Weicker, and we're talking about marriage and family. It's a great class. Highly recommend. Now, what I want to show is just in the case of theology and then law, the theology of the Catholic Church and law and the connection between these two, from this particular instance of marriage. And in the Middle Ages, kind of from the advent of Christ, up through the 14th, 15th century, you have the Catholic Church who establishes the sacramentality of marriage, which directs marriage to something beyond this world, right? And as, an authority, they were able to, that institution was directed apart. But eventually, once you get to like Luther and he denies that, marriage becomes something that is directed towards temporal ends. And what Dr. Weicker likes to say is, he calls it vestigial Catholicism, meaning that they don't recognize what dissembling, that sacramentality of marriage is going to do later, because it's still a very Catholic culture and a very Catholic environment. But as the church, or as the state rather, becomes increasingly secular, the laws begin to be passed, look at where we are today, right? We've got so many things that are so anti-Catholic, and in a sense, you could say atheism is a religion, so to speak. And so it's like to be passing laws that are so diametrically opposed on all fronts to the very basics, of human life and the basics of the Catholic Church's teaching on such things. It's, it's very anti what the Catholic Church would teach. So it goes the other way, right? You lose.
We open to questions?
Yes.
Questions for the gentleman? Chair recognizes Mr. Willey for a question.
So you said that you believe the First Amendment undermines the Catholic position on church and state. Which position, what relationship between church and state does the First Amendment undermine? This is not me clarifying.
Let's see. Because when in terms of articulating that, because I heard what this side said, and I didn't entirely, my memory doesn't snap like that. But when they said it, I was like, yeah, that makes sense in terms of the because I don't know the documents. And so honestly, I don't have a great answer to that. But when they said it, I was like, I can't ask them to repeat it right now. They will probably in their closing. But when I heard it, in terms of the documents, I mean, the basic argument in my understanding would be presupposing the premise that the Catholic Church holds the truth, period, then to and I know there's human freedom, and I know that that's very important, because I would agree with that sentiment in terms of the re-evangelization. But in terms of the church, I would say that because I believe it's the truth, it should be able to have authority and influence in impacting laws that are going to establish a culture of life that holds to the truth, of the Catholic Church, that holds to the truth of reality, that holds to the truth of human beings.
Any questions? Chair recognizes for a question.
Would the point you agree with be that the First Amendment makes it impossible to achieve the ideal which the Church sets before us, and teaches us even that it is not the ideal? Would you agree with that?
I mean, let's see, because I think I want to say yes to that. I'm trying to work through it. Because when you say impossible, I guess that's where I was trying to get that when you said that to Mr. Denley. And what do you mean? Can he clarify that? What does he mean by impossible? No. Okay. Yeah, I mean, sure. We're just going to go with that.
You want to field any more questions, Mr. Feibelman? One more question? Chair recognizes this gentleman here.
So you mentioned Constantine's Rome, recognizing Catholicism, and then I thought back to other countries that have recognized Catholicism as one true religion. You have the Holy Roman Empire. Sure. All of them split up into warring states. A lot of them ended up causing a great deal of damage to the perception of Catholicism. Can you show me the way in which this somehow is worse, undermines the church's teaching more than those countries which did recognize the church's teaching and Catholicism suffered for it?
I mean, the best way that I want to answer that question would just to say that let's look at the laws in our country today. And to me,
unless you guys disagree with me, they're very, very anti-Catholic.
Here.
So while there is always throughout history, because I mean we're fallen, we're never gonna have the utopia on earth that Francis Bacon wanted. We're not. Sorry.
Here.
And so I'm not saying that that would be perfect, but in terms of what's better, you know, in the long run, in light of eternity, because we believe in that, I would definitely say that, you know, while it's not practical just to say, well, let's just overturn it now. I agree with Mr. Denley's point in that, you know, we need to basically go out and, so to speak, re-evangelize, you know, this country. But I still think that that would be, you know, the ideal. Yeah.
All right, the chair will now recognize speeches. The chair recognizes this gentleman here with a fantastic beard.
Before I start, I just want to tell a story. About 2 hours before this debate, Mr. Willie texted me, and I don't know if you guys noticed, but Mr. Willie's from England. And he texted me and asked me if he could borrow my American flag cufflinks. And I cried. I had a tear in my eyes because it was so beautiful. So the principle that I just kind of want to draw attention to, which is really important in sort of wading through topics like this, is comfort with contradictions. Not all good things go together. And that means that there are no perfect laws. So if we could achieve perfect laws, we wouldn't need laws. That make sense? I hope it does. And so what we strive for instead are pragmatic laws. That's what the First Amendment is. It's a pragmatic law. It's pragmatic. Does it? You know, I haven't brushed up on my American history recently, but I don't think this country would be very friendly towards Catholicism if the First Amendment was not ingrained in our blood. I don't think it would be. And pragmatic laws mean that sometimes we give the devil the protection of the law. I'm reminded of the scene. I'm sure everyone knows it, because we're all Catholics. We give the devil the protection of the law. A Man for All Seasons. A Man for All Seasons. Great movie. We all know it because we're Catholic. We're good Catholics, right? There's a scene where Moore is being questioned. Would you give the devil, I'm sorry. Moore is questioning. You would tear down every law in the country to get at the devil. His opponent says, yes, of course. And Moore says, and then what do you do when the devil turns back on you? What do you hide behind? That's what the First Amendment is. I didn't think this was up for debate. Look, the founders did wonderful things, fantastic things. One of the best things they did, in my opinion, they got rid of the divine right of kings. Here's why they did it. It's a bad idea. I understand the theology of it. I know my Aquinas, all authority comes from God. I'm okay with that. But putting that in law, that guy up there, he's got it. He's basically one step below God. That's a horrible idea. I'm just going to end there. Yeah, go ahead.
This gentleman here with a question.
Paul?
Right, so I think what you established is that it's difficult to come up with a law that would be both practical and in line with church teaching on that level. I could be wrong, but basically by saying that we can't Zach's question concerning basically there's a difference between pragmatism and eroding the church, right? So is it not true that a law could both erode and still be pragmatic? That's my question.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's possible. But I don't think that's what's happening in the first. Like they don't go together either. Something pragmatic does not erode the ideal of church teaching. Like those, pragmatism and church teaching are not opposed. Not philosophical pragmatism. But yeah, please.
The chair will recognize Dr. Newman for a question and not a dialogue, please.
Why you brought up the divine rights of kings? It seems to be irrelevant. We're talking about the divine rights of the Holy Catholic Church. To which the state should subordinate itself. It's completely different.
How? I'm sorry, I'm not. That was my fault. You didn't do it. That was my fault.
Just to clarify my question, the divine rights of kings is some idea that somehow the king is appointed directly by God. It's nothing to do with the First Amendment. We're talking about the divine right of the church that Jesus Christ founded to have the state, and to some degree the apparatus of the state, facilitating its mission. I think we have to completely untangle those two. It's a misnomer. Red herring.
Is he allowed to use words like that? They confuse me. No, it's a good question.
Garbage.
No, it's a fair question. It's a fair question. I bring up the divine right of kings because I think that's sort of what the First Amendment rejects. That's what the founders had in mind. That's what the founders had in mind when they said, this is what we're going to do. They said, we don't want that stuff over there across the pond. I'm sorry, that was mean. That was mean. But that's what they had in mind. That's why I bring it up, because it's ingrained in the founders' thinking when they're crafting these documents.
All right, thank you. I'm going to open up the House for another speech. The chair will recognize this lady in the middle who's been waiting patiently.
Hi. So I have a tendency to overthink and try to overanalyze. And I try not to make a decision until I know what it would look like in the long run. And though I believe that in a perfect world, a Catholic state would be fantastic, I want to bring up a couple points. I mean, how many countries that either were Catholic, I don't currently know of any that are, besides possibly, the Vatican, if that's a country. Again, this isn't my forte. But England, France, Spain, every time a country is Catholic, it doesn't matter how long they stay Catholic, it ends in some sort of bloody revolution. And I'm not saying that it's the Catholic Church's fault. Thank you, David. I'm going to get yelled at for this. I'm not saying that that's the way it always has to end up, but how are you going to keep it from being that way? And how are you going to keep a country Catholic? Only elect Catholic officials? How are you going to keep that happening? Please tell me how this is going to keep working in the long run, because what happens when we make Catholicism our government, or our religion recognized by the government? What happens when somebody else gets voted in and says, you know what, I don't like Catholicism, let's change it? You have to have some sort of backup plan. What's to stop it from happening just like it did in the French Revolution, just like it did in Spain, in Mexico? Oh my goodness, Mexico, I don't know if it was technically considered the state religion, but what happened? It isn't, Mexico certainly isn't Catholic now. I'd also like to bring up how we could fix the problem, because I know that we did bring up the fact that in the past, the Supreme Court, Congress, has not sided with Catholicism. But do I think it's the fact that they are not siding with Catholicism, do I think the problem is that Catholicism isn't the state religion? No. I think that the government's got too much power. Thank you. Why don't we give it to the people? And if the people are Catholic, I mean, I'm done. I'll take questions now. Do I choose?
Would you agree, sorry, what's your name?
Cecilia.
Cecilia, would you agree that a lot of your questions arise from the fact that no one on the opposing side has actually ever shown what union of church and state should look like?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The chair will not recognize Mr. Sherlock. The chair will recognize that. Please been waiting very patiently.
Thank you. Okay, so here would be my question. Say we, do you want this? That's okay. Say we did not have any church officials, right? I think one thing we haven't really emphasized yet is the laws that we have in this country regarding abortion, regarding gay marriage, and the fact that at the moment of conception, that type of abortion is typically considered a religious area rather than a universal term. So my question would be, say we had no church officials, typically how it is right now, how would we eradicate laws such as abortion and gay marriage, and would your view be to not choose to do that so that we can have non-Catholic officials?
Okay. So I don't know if I completely understand what you're trying to say, but correct me if I'm wrong. What you're trying to say is how are we going to change the laws that are currently in place if we don't have Catholic officials voting them out?
If we do not remove the First Amendment.
If we do not remove the First Amendment. Because I think what we have to do in those circumstances is not make it a religious issue. Because it's not a religious issue. It's a scientific issue, especially with abortion. I mean, if we make it a religious issue, then there are people that aren't religious. There are people that are religious and aren't Catholic and aren't Christian. They may not believe that according to their religion, a baby should not be killed before it's born. But they know by common sense that a baby should not be killed before it's born. I don't think that necessarily even fits in with what we're talking about, because I don't think that abortion is a religious issue. I think that it factors into religion, but I think that it's more of a common sense issue. Thank you.
The chair will recognize one last question. Chair will recognize Mr. Cirillo for one question.
There's two of them.
Can you point to where in the church's teaching about the ideal of church and state it says that the state ought to coerce people into being Catholic?
I never said that the church had to coerce people into being Catholic, and I never said that the church said that. I mean, I don't think that's really the issue here. My question is mainly, how are we going to keep the state being Catholic, not how is the state going to keep people being Catholic?
All right, thank you for your time. The chair will now recognize Mr. Harold for a speech.
Here, here.
First off, the atmosphere in this chamber tonight is terrible. This is not the United States Senate. This is a parliamentary chamber. Now, with that in mind, I expect that for every good point I make tonight, by which I mean every point I make tonight, there will be rapturous, cheering, stomping, waving of the arms, and whatever else. Now to the issue at hand. I think we can all agree that America is a pretty great place. Some have even called it the second greatest country in the world. However, great though it may be, we must, or you must as Americans, also bear in mind your Catholic identity, a point which was highlighted by Pope Leo XIII. when he spoke and condemned the heresy of Americanism. Now the question before us is, how does the First Amendment relate to the Catholic view of church and state? And or I should say, the Right Honourable Gentleman from Trinity Hall, Mr. Willie, he spoke of James Madison and complained that those of us on the affirming side this evening have only spoken of James Madison and one other. And he said that wasn't appropriate. But there's a reason for that, and the reason is that James Madison is the one who wrote the Bill of Rights. Now, who was James Madison? He was a deist, most likely a Freemason. He was someone who publicly opposed the use of military chaplains in Virginia. Now, okay, you may say, Madison was not the best dude, but the First Amendment is still a good thing that doesn't undermine Catholic values. Fair enough. Well, as the Right Honourable Gentleman Mr. Cirilla has pointed out, in determining the meaning of the First Amendment, what we should look to is the rulings of the Supreme Court. So let's do that now. In 1947, Everson v. Board of Education, there was a landmark ruling which incorporated the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment and declared that from that point forward, the First Amendment should be understood as applying not only to Congress on the federal level, but to the individual states as well. Given this, the dichotomy that Mr. Willie has tried to posit, and Ms. Perham, between the federal and the state level, falls flat. In 1961, Tarasco v. Watkins, the Supreme Court ruled that you could not, in a state, have a religious identity test to gain public office. In 1971, in another landmark ruling, which Mr. Cirilla alluded to, in Lemon v. Kurtzman, the Supreme Court laid down the criteria for a law to pass and to not infringe upon the First Amendment. Those criteria stated that any law must only have a secular purpose, that it must not promote an excessive entanglement of government and religion, and that it may not have a primarily religious purpose. And we've seen this again in Stone versus Graham in 1980, in Lee versus Wiseman, and we've seen it over the course of the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. That ruling, Lemon versus Kurtzman, by the way, was a ruling made 8-1. So the definitive ruling of this country and of its highest legal authority is that the First Amendment leaves no room for an establishment of the church either on the federal level or on the state level. And as we heard from the Right Honourable Dr. Newton, that flatly contradicts Catholic teaching. If you don't trust him, just go and read the Syllabus of Errors. Given this, my friends, hard though it may be, we have to accept the fact this evening that the First Amendment, as it has been interpreted and as it has been handed down, does in fact undermine the Catholic view of church and state. And so what I would say to the chamber this evening is that yes, America is a wonderful place, but as Catholics we should always be looking to make it that bit more wonderful. We should be looking to enculturate our Catholic values into the American culture. And by doing that, by affirming the motion tonight, we can all play a part in making America great again.
Questions for the Right Honourable Mr. Harold? To recognize the other Honourable Brit in the room, besides Dr. Newman, of course.
So, Mr. Harold, are you implying, with the majority of your speech, that misinterpretations in the 20th century should define our understanding of the Founding Fathers' intents.
Yeah.
All the Founding Fathers who wrote it, not just James Madison.
So what Mr. Willie is asking is he is saying, is there not some difference between the First Amendment as it was originally proposed and the First Amendment as it is today? To that I would say a couple of things. First of all, who decides what the First Amendment means? Well, unfortunately, it's not Mr. Willie. The body which decides what the First Amendment means, and most in the room are probably happy about this, is the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, building on its precedents, has decided that it does, in fact, not allow for religion either on the state or on the federal level, and for that reason it undermines the Catholic view of church and state. And the second thing I would say is that if we read the motion carefully, the word undermines is in the present tense. We're dealing with the First Amendment as it exists today, not as it existed when it was first proposed.
The chair recognizes Mr. Dinley for a question.
So, with the understanding of the Supreme Court, it interprets what the Constitution says, so I don't see how that proves any point about it going contrary. It's just a furthering of what we mean by the First Amendment. But I'd like to ask, with any positing of an ideal, you also have to posit what would be the means to reach that ideal. And if the First Amendment and freedom of religion is not the way by which we bring about that kingdom that we're hoping for, what would you provide as an alternative?
Here I refer simply to what Dr. Newton has already expressed to the chamber, that while there is of course a difference between the means and the end, in the question at hand, we're dealing with an amendment that says definitively that the Catholic view of church and state is impossible and must be ruled out. So sure, we can have a conversation about the best way to get to a Catholic society, but that is not the discussion we're having tonight. The discussion we're having is about the First Amendment as it is written. And the First Amendment as it is written, as the Supreme Court has expressed, does in fact undermine the Catholic view of church and state.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I don't see how that's an alternative, though. If we're going to say it undermines or whatever else, in a practical sense, you have to say, okay, the church should be working for this means. To say it undermines, it's an incomplete answer. It's the first step, maybe, but if you're going to provide, you have to give the second step, or it's not a full walk.
Okay, I'll offer you an alternative. Get rid of the First Amendment.
Chairman, I recognize one more question for the Honorable Mr. Harold. Chair recognizes.
Are you aware of what amendment prevented Hobby Lobby, the Sisters of the, Little Sisters of the Poor, I'm Catholic, from having to abide by the HHS mandate?
The 14th. And with that, I yield the floor.
The chair will now open the floor to another speech. Is it McKenna? Okay, the chair will recognize Mr. McKenna for a speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know we are Catholic here, but I hope you all know what happened in Genesis 3. Can anyone tell me what happened in Genesis 3, just very briefly, if I may?
The fall.
Exactly. The fall of man. Thank you very much, Dr. Sorrell. I hope that the rest of you were taking notes on that fact. Genesis 3 equals the fall of man. Okay, now that we've gone over this point of theology, the fall of man happened in Genesis 3. And in that fall, what we saw was God gave man a choice. He gave man a choice between following him and honoring him and choosing what was wrong. Choosing the devil, choosing sin. But he gave man the freedom of choice. And in this, I believe we see a paradox, an apparent paradox that we must resolve, and is the whole realm, the foundation of this debate tonight. The paradox between recognizing the church as the truth and the freedom of choice due to all men to choose the truth. Where does the moderation lie? Where do we find the middle in this choice? Well, now that I presented the paradox, let's take a look at the First Amendment and the distinction between church and state that it provides, the moderation I would argue that it provides, and why I believe that in fact the proposed motion is incorrect, and that all of you should vote against the proposed motion, because in fact the First Amendment supports a distinction of church and state and not a separation thereof. And let's take a look at that first in light of more biblical examples. I hope you all are aware of what happened in 1 and 2 Samuel. If I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Sirla, but in that book, the prophet Samuel anoints King David as king. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Sirla. Okay. And in doing so, he anointed him as king to make laws in order to promote the truth in the land of Israel. Unfortunately, as all of us know, King David sinned. King David erred. King David at times did not promote the truth and those laws. Yet, it was not immediate that his kingship was revoked. And in fact, his authority was still there and ordained by God, despite the fact that he violated the truth. What we see here is the foundation of the Catholic theology that has already been posited by the affirming side, that there is a necessary distinction between church and state, and that the church must be recognized. Because what happened was Samuel gave advice to David on what to do, and David refused to listen. David refused to make the right choice in support of the truth, but yet he still had the authority to act. This brings up the clear point that I want to make tonight. What the First Amendment allows is it allows the church to operate freely in the United States. And what it promotes is the fact that the church, in a sense, anoints the United States government with the authority to make law. I believe we can all agree to that. It does not anoint every decision that this government makes. In fact, sometimes it needs to contradict the decisions made. But that does not deny the fact that we need the freedom of choice given by that amendment in order to make the conscious choice that the truth is the truth. Because if I am unable to make that conscious choice, if every member of the United States government is unable to make that conscious choice, then I believe we are fundamentally taking away the very decision that God gave us at the beginning of time in Genesis 3. That is why we must properly understand the role of the church. And this brings me into a final point. The fact at the end, the promotion of the church, the promotion of the truth, the promotion of making the right choice comes down to us, but more importantly, it comes down to our church leaders. How many of us can name a time that the USCCB or other organizations or a single bishop has condemned a law or something that the United States government has said contradictory to church teaching? It is rare that we see something passed down. It is even rare sometimes that we see the Catholic populace act and react in response of taking up our freedom of religion in order to tell the government that they're wrong. It is our responsibility to make the choice for the truth. And for that reason, I would argue that we as the United States government have the possibility, through making choices and voting in certain leaders, to support Catholic truths in the United States government. And that is something that can be promoted by the First Amendment and not destroyed by it thereof. Thank you.
Chair recognizes questions. Chair recognizes this gentleman here for a question.
Mr. Hahn.
So, okay, sorry. Alex, or, yeah, Mr. McKenna. I'm sorry, anyways, a little tired. It's all right. Getting a little nervous, okay. So, sorry to split hairs, but I just wanted to know how you would respond, just using your biblical precedents, for, Adam in the fall, who is both, he is leader, but also priest in the garden. And then you also use David, but the prophet isn't the priestly figure in this. Actually, it's David is both king and priest, right? There's no distinction between church and state in the Davidic line, right? Because David is both priest In the priestly order of the line of Melchizedek. Yes, sir.
But let's take a look at the biblical tradition going there forward, right? So I can admit that we had in there the priest and the king in one. But at the end of the day, the power still was left in the prophet for choosing and anointing who was the king.
Chair recognizes Dr. Cirilla for a question.
Don't you see how your argument fails when what you're doing is saying because God gave Adam and Eve freedom to choose, we should as well with respect to religion, when what God actually said is don't eat the fruit. He gave them the freedom to disobey, and when they did, he punished them coercively with the most severe punishment imaginable, which is eternal separation in hell. And there's no comparison between that, don't you see, and the First Amendment, which doesn't say don't do anything. It says be any religion you want at all, and there's no penalty. So there's really no comparison.
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying, Dr. Cirilla. I would, and by the way, I'm arguing all this for the sake of argument. I'm actually going to vote with this side, but sorry. Just wanted to put that out there. Dr. Cirilla, I would wholeheartedly disagree, actually. And my reason being would be twofold. That in fact, what we see in the Eden account in Genesis 3 is twofold. We see first the freedom given by God, and secondly, his telling them how to use that freedom. I would argue that the First Amendment gives us the freedom to act, and it is us as people and the Congress that must act appropriately within the bounds of that freedom. And that is the reason why I would argue that we must continue to have the First Amendment in order to promote truth as God gave us. But with the fundamental understanding that the United States should and ought and has an obligation to promote the truth, if not explicitly, at least implicitly.
Here, here.
The chair will now recognize Dr. Plato for the last question for the speaker.
So since you let the cat out of the hat that you're actually going to vote for this side,
Yes.
for all those people that were following you, really liking what you were saying and hissing
Yeah,
at
sorry.
his opposition and all that, right? So why don't you believe yourself?
Oh, I'd love to answer that. All right, so it starts with a man named Niccolo Machiavelli. And following from that, a nice man named Thomas Hobbes. And Mr. Feivelman over here is very ecstatic upon hearing this. How much time do I have to answer this question, by the way? 2 minutes? Oh, great. Okay, so I'm going to sum up exactly what Machiavelli and Hobbes did. Machiavelli presents in his The Prince pretty much that man does not have an immortal soul, for that reason should not fear heaven or hell, and therefore exactly what he needs to do is to act upon his desires for whatever is going to bring him the most pleasure and the least pain. This is continued in Hobbes in his atomistic materialism, where he clearly defines that man must act only based upon his desires and upon merely everything he wants, acting out of desire for pleasure and against pain. And from that, we get this whole idea that every religion should be valued because it has some truth in it, or maybe even no truth in it. But at the end of the day, every religion should be valued equally under the First Amendment. And because of that, because of what Hobbes and Machiavelli say, that we want pleasure, we don't want pain, this is an exact implication of that, directly draws from that, because what it allows is for us to create a religion that promotes our pleasures in order to mitigate our pains, and brings everything back to the subjective person rather than to what is the truth.
Thank you, Mr. McKenna, for your speech. Now we're going to move to the lightning round. So if you didn't get a chance to speak here or you don't want to take questions, you get, if I call on you, you can get 2 minutes to speak your mind and then sit down. No questions for that round. We're going to have about hopefully 6 or 7 speeches for the lightning round, so I'll go ahead and field those. Chair recognize Mr. Hahn for a speech.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is David, and I'm very nervous. I'm also kind of tired, so bear with me. So a couple of things. Ms. Pottervinsky over here brought up a great point of how one would live out a Catholic society, and it's been brought up many times. They asked Mr. Harold how this would be done, and I answered that. Sacramental theology, okay? The sacraments are the basis of our society. In marriage and the family, this is where we see it lived out and brought up. We see it nourished through the Holy Eucharist. We see it healed through confession. We see it strengthened and given zeal in confirmation and makes it potent, all right? We see it perpetuated through the priesthood and holy orders. This is important to the faith, And this stretches to the individual level. Now, to the level of the state has the responsibility, as it's received the power from God, to acknowledge God and his church and Jesus Christ as the source of this power. Now, I'm not saying that it should mandate that every single person become a Catholic, but I am going to say definitively that it should be the preferred religion, without any equivocation. That this is the truth, and as much as I agree with Mr. McKenna, I would also say, with the distinction of libertas, which is the freedom to truth, that we all have as humans, but also not just liberum arbitrum, that we don't just get arbitrary choice between falsehood and truth. That is not what our country is here for. Our country is here to protect, really, our God-given right to be able to be Catholic, to be able to live in this good society, to be able to have access to divine joy and fulfillment as Catholics and as people. Because this is where we find our true selves in the Catholic Church through our vocations. And the First Amendment, by keeping the state from being able to recognize the church, completely undermines this view of sacramental theology and society in general.
Please conclude.
I want to thank Dr. Cirillo for making one of the greatest points I think anyone has made, and Mr. Harold for being amazing.
The chair will recognize Dr. Cirillo.
Really quickly, I'm so edified by all of you folks, and I can't wait to see what you all end up doing in your careers and lives, because you're all wonderful on both sides of this. So I think there's been some confusion about the very precise issue at hand, which is whether the First Amendment undermines the Catholic view on church and state. It's not how to, the means to get to the Catholic vision. And I'd like to clarify a few things. The unhealthy and sinful and violent manifestations that are well known in history of the abuse of state office that was also held by bishops. Bishops in the medieval period were also temporal lords. They had armies, and there was, I think, to some degree, unhealthy connection there. The church has never said that church hierarchy members should be the temporal lords. That happened, but that's not the church's doctrine. Nor is the church's doctrine, you'll not find this, that people have to be manipulated, strong-armed, or forced into conversions. Never has been. Now, does that mean that that hasn't happened? No, it has happened. But that's not the church's view of church and state. The church's official view. You don't look at the abuses of it to say, well, we don't want to do that. Of course you don't want to do that. The church doesn't want that either. All right? Officially, okay? So there's some, I just thought that would be good to clarify.
Thank you, Doctor. The chair will now recognize one more speech for the, if we could have somebody from the opposing side. We've had a couple from the affirmative. Chair will recognize this gentleman here.
Hello everyone, I'm sure you all know me, just kidding, you don't. So let's take a look at what the resolution actually says, because we're talking about is whether we should affirm this specific resolution. So it talks about, are we really undermining the Catholic view of church and state? To which I would question whether we're actually doing this. So we've heard this brought up many times. It was asked of Mr. Harold, can we really provide an actual alternative to the current status quo? And we really can't, because the ideal alternative that we would all, the ideal alternative I think we would say we want is that the Catholic Church is recognized above all the religions. Now, that is not a realistic, currently that is not a realistic alternative, because that will not happen. Let's look at what would have actually happened if we had an actual alternative to this, because the alternative to this, when the First Amendment was actually written, would have been Protestantism or something other than the Catholic Church being held above everything else. So, is this, the First Amendment, really undermining the Catholic Church's view on church and state? I don't think so, because to undermine, there would have to be an actual realistic option out there that would have been able to happen. There would have to be something like that out there. I hope you can understand what I'm trying to say. So basically, the real issue is here, I'm not contesting that this may contradict the church's view, but I am saying there's no real alternative out there. You might say, we want the Catholic Church to be held at the highest point. How many people in this country right now are actually Catholic? There are more Protestants in this country than Catholics. So if that's what you want, if you want Protestantism to be held higher than nothing, that's fine. But we're not going to see anything better than the current status quo coming about. So I think because of the specific wording of this resolution, because it says it undermines, not because it says it contradicts, because it says we undermine the view of Catholic teaching on church and state, I think we can agree that this resolution, yada, yada, yada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to recognize one more speech. I'll recognize this young lady here. You have a Polish last name, so I'm not even going to attempt at it. So.
I would like to just bring up one more thing that we haven't really talked about. It's something that Mr. McKenna and Mr. Hahn sort of briefly mentioned. And that is that according to Aristotle and reaffirmed by St. Thomas Aquinas, the purpose of laws are to orient us to the common good. Laws are supposed to bring us closer to the common good. And this amendment is not based on that Aristotelian view or the view of St. Thomas Aquinas, because it is based on the views of Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes, which means that our desires are conflicting and we need to allow as many people to realize their desires as possible. And this amendment allows all religions to exist United States equally, and I believe that they should not, according to Catholic social teaching, because the Catholic Church has the truth and we should teach that truth, and that is more important and should be emphasized more than license to do whatever we see fit.
Thank you very much for that speech. We're going to do one more for the lightning round, just one more. I like this discussion. Okay, this gentleman here may speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, so we want to look at this amendment. The gentleman back there mentioned that we don't historically when it was written that the alternative is Protestantism. Well, I mean, the whole point of amendments is that you can get rid of them if you want to. So let's just get rid of it. Let's leave that over there. So we look at there's a majority Protestantism in this country. That's very clear and evident. This just emphasizes the problem with democracy. The problem with mob rule is that the majority rules, and oftentimes, especially in America, the majority is wrong. We've seen this in cases like Roe v. Wade, where even though it was a small number of people voting, the majority was wrong. We say if we take away the First Amendment and a Protestant state is established, due to the majority is wrong. So let's kind of just forget that for a moment and focus on what this actually means. The First Amendment is an endorsement of decadence, an endorsement of degeneracy, an endorsement of degeneracy. You're allowing other religions to flourish. You're completely allowing other religions to flourish, other religions that shouldn't flourish. The Catholic Church, by not outright opposing this, is doing the equivalent of shooting itself in the foot, while Muslims, Jews, atheists, Hindus shoot the Catholic Church in the head. And Sun Tzu rolls in his grave. So this is completely an endorsement of everything that we stand against as Catholics, because our goal is to bring the kingdom of God to earth. And when you allow, Miss Perham mentioned, this allows the Catholic Church to flourish. It allows the enemies of the Catholic Church to flourish just as well. And the Catholic Church definitely has more enemies than allies. And so this, by virtue of basic math, this is completely immoral and
Thank you for your speech. I would like to reserve a question for myself. Are not the wheat and the chaff supposed to grow up together?
Is the chaff not separated and burnt?
It is, but not in this life. All right, so we're going to move on to the closing speeches. So I'd like to invite the closing speaker for the affirmative side. Yes.
Okay, so I mean, just some great discussion, but I think it's quite simple. I think it's been established what the Catholic Church teaches on this matter. I'm not sure that's actually even disputed. I think it wasn't really disputed, that it's definitively taught by the Catholic Church that the state has the obligation to give a special privilege to her and to help her in her mission. Well, the First Amendment of the US Constitution makes that impossible. So there is clearly a contradiction. It makes it impossible. Just think of that. You cannot do it without repealing that amendment. So they are diametrically opposed. Now, certain things that we need to clarify that our side at least, I don't think is claiming. We're not claiming that you have to do this now, that the Catholic Church has to be established now. We've never claimed that. We don't need to claim that to uphold our position. We certainly don't think that, however it would come about, that it could lead at all to coercion. In fact, that would be one of the principles. However it comes about in a way that does not coerce persons to join the Catholic Church if they don't wish to join the Catholic Church. And the fact that we cannot do it now is clear, but that doesn't mean we should make it impossible to do. Yeah? That's the point, isn't it? We can't do it now, but why make it impossible to do? Yeah? And it's for this reason that not only are the two sides, Catholic position and the US Constitution, First Amendment, diametrically opposed, it is undermining of the Catholic position because it teaches that it is not an ideal. It teaches that we should never do that. You could just, when you make the Constitution, just leave it out. Just leave it out. Don't need to have one of those. But you put a double lock on it ever happening. Why? Because you don't want it to happen. Yeah? Oh. Yeah? So I think not only, therefore, is it diametrically opposed, it teaches that it should never happen, and it makes it nearly impossible to happen. Basically, it comes down to this. In order for what the Catholic Church says the state ought to do, you have to repeal the First Amendment. If you have to repeal the First Amendment to get into the situation that is the duty of the state to get into, there's something wrong with that amendment. Yeah? So all right-thinking people will undoubtedly see that and vote for our position.
Thank you, Dr. Newman. When I rang that bell and you looked back at me, I was so tempted to say it's tea time. I'm sorry. So I'm now going to recognize the opposition, the closing speaker.
Well, this has been a vigorous debate tonight, and it's kind of nice, to be honest, though, to come to the conclusion of it, isn't it? And to be able to vote and actually express our opinion. I would want to pick up on one point that Dr. Cirillo made that I just actually want to clarify is not correct. It wasn't that we couldn't get a professor here tonight because we contradict Catholic teaching by holding the position that we do, because we wouldn't be here if that was the case. I just wanted to be clear that this isn't an orthodoxy point, if anyone thinks this is. Now, let's go on to the point that, quite frankly, apart from using the phrase preferential treatment, there has really been no clarification of what the Catholic view of church and state means, and therefore how the First Amendment undermines it. Look, you can't, okay, there's been also, Dr. Newton said, they're not even required to show what that should look like, how you should get there. But if they're not required to show how they should get there, then how can we know that it undermines getting there? Okay, that's a key point. The next point that I think really has to be made is that, again, the idea of wall of separation comes from a misinterpretation that originated with Jefferson, and that was built into the key interpretation in the 1950s. We are not responsible for the fact that what the Founding Fathers wrote and what I showed was the Founding Fathers' intent has been misinterpreted. It is also fallacious to say America is not a Catholic country today and it has some anti-Catholic laws. Therefore, the First Amendment is the reason it happened. You're missing a step. You have to show how the First Amendment undermined and brought us to this situation. Quite frankly, if the First Amendment did not exist, if it was not written into the Bill of Rights, we would not be here tonight debating it. We would not be allowed to freely express our opinions. Now, just because we all agree that the conclusion, what we are all aiming for, is a recognition, or whatever it is the supporting side wants, it doesn't mean, so just because we can all recognize that, we can also see that the First Amendment allows for that to happen over time if the culture is evangelized. Look, the states, under the First Amendment, originally as written, the states have the authority to establish Catholicism. It would not have been prudent to not have this First Amendment. It's an essential part of the Bill of Rights. To remove it is ridiculous. And as I come to the conclusion of my speech, I would just say that you have to think back on all the arguments. You have to think back on whether or not the side supporting the opposing the First Amendment really ever showed us in what specific way it undermines the Catholic teaching on church and state. And people like Mr. McKenna, I would challenge you to think, you don't decide halfway through the debate how you're going to vote. You should decide it at the end. Right now, oppose the motion, support the First Amendment. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that closing speech. Before we actually have the vote, first off, I encourage you all to stay for the vote so you can all have a voice in it. But before we end the night, I'm going to hand over the floor to our honorable president of the Veritas Society, Mr. Harold, for a few remarks. So go ahead and stew on what you're going to decide for the vote while he speaks.
Hey guys, I won't keep you long. Just to briefly explain to you some of the things that we do in the Veritas Society as you're thinking about your vote, and you're going to be deciding tonight which side you think offered the best arguments. I was told actually by Mr. Denny that I'm not allowed to tell you which way to vote. So, but in terms of what the Veritas Society does, we run these debates, as you can see, and we'll be running more of these later in the semester. Our next one, I think, is not till March 31st, but do look out for that. And before we get to that, we're hoping to have a smaller scale devil's advocate debate, which is where you can come and confront some people who are arguing for a contrary position, a position contrary to Catholic teaching, and then you can test your apologetic skills. Also, in that vein of apologetics, every Wednesday we have seminars. They're called the On Guard seminars, a reply to the modern world. That's Wednesdays at 7 p.m. in the Fireside Lounge. And that's a group discussion. It's quite Socratic, where, again, we take contrary viewpoints, whether it be on same-sex marriage or the existence of God, on Islam, whatever it might be, and we really get to grips with those arguments. We try to understand the other side's arguments better than they do, and then we go about responding to them. So again, that's Wednesday, 7 p.m. in the Fireside Lounge. Really encourage you to come to that. The topic this Wednesday is the existence of God. And then the final thing is that together with the St. Vitus Dance Club, Veritas is going to be co-hosting a ballroom dance on March 2nd. So that's Saturday, March 2nd. It's going to be a masquerade Mardi Gras ballroom dance, and it's going to be a formal affair. Miss Walk was complaining to me the other day that, or wasn't complaining to me, she was asking me what the ladies should wear, and I wasn't particularly helpful. But basically it's going to be pretty formal in nature, so whatever, like a dress, would be good. Not for the guys though, guys can just wear a suit. But yeah, that's going to be March 2nd, it's a Saturday, and we hope you all turn out to that for a nice cultural event on campus. So thank you all so much for coming, and make sure you vote the right way this evening.
Couldn't help yourself, could you? All right, so we're going to move on to the vote. The way you vote is just stand up where you are. So first off, we're going to have the abstention. So anyone who wants to abstain from the voting this evening, please stand up and we'll count you. Are you voting, Maggie? Okay. And now we're going to move on to the affirming side. All the affirmative votes, please stand. Okay, you may be seated. Thank you. And then for all those who wish to oppose the motion, please rise. Count 20.
All right, with 11 abstentions, 48 affirming, and 20 opposing, motion is passed.
Thank you so much for being here. Let's all stand up. We're going to close in a prayer. Can you all stand for the closing prayer? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.